Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our webinar, which maybe some of you have noticed we renamed to be more general. So it used to be using Facebook as a research tool, but we realized that we're not just interested in Facebook as a platform, but more in social media in general, which is actually something that our speakers today also pointed out. So therefore, we kind of broadened a bit the name of the webinar series, which it always has been designed to kind of think more about social media platforms and how we can use it in our research. We're really happy to resume with 2 sessions this week and also next Tuesday. Today we have Katrin Weller and Indira Sen, and they are giving us an overview of their work on the pitfalls, potential and pitfalls of social media research. This is just an introduction. We were just talking about this. They have an excellent workshop coming up very soon on this topic, and this is a kind of overview introduction. So hopefully this kind of gives you a bit of a taster and so on. Just a few ground rules. As you saw, we're recording this session, so this will be available to view afterwards in case some of the things go a bit fast. Don't worry, you can go over this again on your own time. And then the second, we have about 40 minutes for Katrin and Indira for their presentation. And then we have a Q&A as always. So do post your questions in the Q&A function. The chat doesn't work so well. I would suggest let's use the Q&A function. Aykut and I will keep an eye on it. If there's something that is more like a clarification, we can pick this up immediately. Maybe Katrin and Indira, as you're two as well, maybe also keep an eye out if you pick up something that maybe is worth kind of just clarifying, and then we leave the more general questions for the end. Okay. So just a kind of quick introduction of our speakers in more detail. Indira is a doctoral candidate of computational social science at GESIS in Cologne, and she's interested in understanding the biases in inferential studies from digital traces with a focus on natural language processing. Katrin Weller is an information scientist working at the computational social science department at GESIS, and also she's leading a team at the Digital Society Observation, and she's also co-lead of the research and data methods team at the Center of Advanced Internet Studies. And in her research, Katrin focuses on social media, new types of research data, and data preservation, scholarly communication, and altmetrics. So all of these topics are very relevant for what we're trying to do here with our webinar series. So with no further ado, over to you two, and I'm very much looking forward to this talk.
Thanks for the kind introduction, and also thanks for pointing out the workshop that we're doing, which will be in December on 4 half days with a bit more hands-on stuff also and practical exercises. Today we will mainly give you the topical overview and some more theoretical introductions to the things we've been working on. And so we've named our talk Acknowledging Potential Pitfalls in Social Media Research, and we will outline some of these pitfalls, but specifically also an approach on how to systematically acknowledge these kind of pitfalls and challenges that we encounter when working with social media as a base of new types of research data. And yeah, that is also the framing that we'd like to state in the beginning. So we come from a perspective in where we see social media platforms as a potential new source for collecting new types of research data. Since we come from a computational social science perspective, this is often viewed in contrast to survey data or other forms of social science research that would rather work with reaching out to participants, asking them questions in some way or the other. And here in this context, online platforms and specifically social media platforms, since they are part of so many aspects of our daily life, have become a new interesting source of data about our about these different areas of lives on their own, and have therefore become, over the past years, the object of studies in quite a few academic research fields. So we've been thinking about this as the ABC of humans that we want to capture through social media. So the attitudes or opinions, certain types of behavior, but also certain types of characteristics of user groups. And all this based on traces that people leave while they are using social media platforms, and for example posting messages, following others, liking things, and this kind of behavior that leaves traces that we can as researchers access in some way or the other. And in this sense, social media platforms are quite interesting to researchers because in some topical areas, they, as a sensor of what humans leave as traces, might recall certain facts even better than human memory. So for example, you might have encountered these cases where you have been at a place maybe a few years ago and you don't exactly remember what year it was, but you turn to your Facebook profile to look up, I posted this photo, so what date was it actually? So in this case, Facebook might have a better record of when you did something specifically than your own memory. And if you are asked in a survey, how often do you call your parents on the phone? It might be more difficult to answer that from your memory than by looking up your phone actually to see how often you have in or outgoing calls with a specific person. So in some cases, the traces you leave when interacting with online platforms and social media might be quite helpful. Also, researchers value social media platforms since they are a way to get very immediate reactions from people on ongoing events. For example, let's name a few recent examples like the protest in Iran, or also some issues around COVID measures, for example. These are things that happen often unforeseeable, unplanned, and if you want to study opinions on these events by running a survey, you need quite some preparation time, whereas people comment on these things basically as they unfold, as the events unfold in online spaces, on social media platforms, and therefore this might be a better source for quick access to people's opinions on these topics. And then there are other cases where social media data might enable looking into topics that people don't want to talk about in a survey situation or in an interview situation, maybe like aspects of sexuality, aspects of substance abuse, for example, but they still might leave traces on specific social media platforms when sharing certain images or other digital traces. So sometimes social media platforms offer insights into behavior that is very hard to capture otherwise. Of course, this comes with a big but, since we will talk a bit more on ethical challenges in this context. We have a situation where the data that we want to look at are created without any stimulus from the researcher, which is of course quite nice since it's to some degree unbiased, but it also is not created with consent in a sense that people are aware that this is being used for research at a later point in time, which comes with quite a lot of ethical challenges on the other end, and also methodological issues. So today we'd like to start with summarizing a bit from some work that I've been doing with my colleague Katharina Kinder-Kollander, and we have interviewed researchers who work with different types of social media data, coming from different backgrounds over the course of time. And I will use the insights we gained from these interviews to kind of set the stage a bit on some general observations about what is social media research at the moment. And here it's important to know that we're not looking at a consistent research field. So there is not such a thing as this is social media research, this is how it's done, this is the go-to guide that you can follow step by step, but it's rather a field where people from various disciplinary backgrounds come to this specific data source, get interested in this specific data source with quite different motivations and quite different research questions. So that means they might be interested in a lot of different platforms. So some are maybe more interested in the big things like Facebook, YouTube, Twitter. Others might be more interested in niche platforms. Others might be more interested in like the networks behind user interactions. Other more in the content that people are sharing. They will use quite different methods for analyzing data, from quantitative to qualitative things. They might also have very different skill sets with which they approach social media research, and this often also applies to skills for collecting the data. So I think we by now mainly assume that people will work with an API access to collecting data from platforms, which is like the technical interface that lets you capture data in a specific format with metadata attached. But there's also research based on web scraping contents from platforms, or even screenshotting certain parts of a platform and then or manually copy pasting text and using that, depending on the technical skills, but also the specific research design needed for a research question. Maybe if you want to capture the entire look and feel of the platform, a screenshot is actually the better way to do that and to capture that. There's a lot about the technical opportunities to access social media data. Often this is restricted in some way or the other by the platforms themselves or by the technical tools that you have for accessing the data. And there has been quite some debate about the different settings with unequal opportunities to access data. Also, people who are in direct collaborations with the main platforms might have special access to these kinds of data versus those who are depending on the public APIs and other contexts. What we've seen in our interviews with social media researchers is that a lot of them share similar experiences when it comes to the challenges for interacting with social media platforms and the complexities they are untangled in. So they often report things like this. They report issues with data access being problematic, they not being able to get the exact meta information of what data what the subset of data is that they can actually get from an API. Platforms act as a black box where you don't know what's going on behind the scenes, how the algorithm, for example, interferes with what the users get to see. The methods that you want to apply for studying certain things might add additional black boxes. For example, when implementing a specific sentiment analysis tool, you often also don't always know what's going on behind the scenes. You have issues of missing data, for example, since it's very dynamic, data might get deleted, accounts might get deleted, other things might just go technically wrong because of outages while you're collecting the data. There might have been gaps. So these are quite a few things that have been reported. It's also an area where a lot of things are changing constantly. So I think we're now at a very interesting phase, since we don't know what's happening to Twitter at the moment, and if the access options that we have today for getting data off the platform will still be available maybe tomorrow or in a few days and weeks from now on. Sometimes terms of services may change and these kind of issues. And you also have a lot of, as we already said, tensions for trying to arrive at ethical research setups to respect user expectations, privacy restrictions, and these kind of things, also in a quite international environment where different legal situations might be in place. And we also came across like challenges of different publishing practices, different expectations from journals when it comes to, for example, sharing the underlying data set and other interdisciplinarity issues. So these are a few things that many people mentioned in the interviews and that kind of reappeared as themes throughout our interviews. But it was quite interesting to see how people draw different conclusions when it came to addressing specific challenges. So for example, in the context of research ethics, we saw quite some difference in whether people were considering to or were identifying themselves as doing big data research, like kind of sharing perspectives like we're not interested in individuals at all, we're just looking at the network, the aggregated data, these kind of things, versus people who would do very close ethnographic research on an individual scale. And of course, this matters a lot for how you perceive ethical approaches in that context. We also saw differences of people who are really looking into, for example, creative practice of users on social media platforms, and who would see them rather as some sort of authors who need to be quoted, who need to be acknowledged for their work, versus the perspective of seeing social media platform users as research subjects, which have a right to be anonymous and should be treated quite differently to these authors. I think the clearest distinction is when we come to looking into data from vulnerable groups, and that can be minors, that can be activists, that can be other types of groups, versus very public actors, public accounts like politicians, and of course there's also a degree of those who are more prominent than others. And yeah, this leads to quite different decisions in how to, for example, quote from individual users, how to display usernames in a paper, and these kind of things. We also saw quite different conclusions when it comes to data sharing. So how much data people would be make available for reuse from their own data sets. And here I think the interesting part to us was that there was quite some groups of people who believed that they really should share the data because it's their ethical obligation, not only towards the scientific research community, but also towards the social media users who are the basis for the actual data set. And this is because social media data aren't ordinary research data, as we pointed out. They are not based on this consent. They are kind of this unobtrusively collected data from a platform, and this leads to some researchers expressing that we feel that this is rather public. It doesn't belong to us as a researcher. We have to give it back to the community where we took it from. Yeah, also kind of this inequality in access for different types of researchers led to some sort of gray market where people would, researchers would pass on data sets to one another if they felt like this was their obligation at that point. So we've looked a bit more closer into this tension between enabling reproducibility versus enabling privacy protection of users. And in practice, we can see that this is quite yeah, still an ongoing debate of how much can we actually share if we share a data set collected from a social media platform, with people sometimes sharing whole data sets plus additional information like the scripts that were used to collect it, to others only sharing, for example, tweet IDs, where then you would have to go back to the platform, collect the same data again, and kind of in that way enable some sort of dropout mechanism for if a tweet got deleted by that time, it will no longer show up in the data set, which of course is bad for reproducibility, but good for giving people an option to remove their traces. In our interviews, researchers rather wanted their data to be shareable, but they faced certain obstacles, like not knowing what was possible to legally share with others, what was the technical options to make data sets available. So they sometimes arrived at the conclusion, I really want to make my data reproducible, I really want to share my data, but I just don't know how, or the terms of service is permitted, so I can't really do it, which led to this frustration at some points. On the other hand, the researchers we spoke to were not so keen to reuse existing data sets, or it was quite depending on their skill level actually. But people would say something like, there's too much uncertainty in it. I don't really know how the other person collected the data, what's actually in it, how valuable it is as a data source for my research question, and how it was processed and analyzed. So this was a theme we got quite frequently in these interviews, and that is actually also something we're observing in our context at GESIS as a research institution. Yeah, overall, we saw a high awareness of potential pitfalls in handling social media data as research data throughout the interviews, but lack of good practice for making processes transparent, for documenting how certain solutions might be looked like that have been found throughout the way. And I think this sums it up quite well. So people admitted that they also don't document much, or maybe not enough, to make others able to judge the quality of a data set, for example. Yeah, so we arrive at the conclusion that a lot of the decisions that researchers make on their day-to-day basis when working with social media data are hidden to the general research community. And so are many of their lessons learned throughout the way when handling the different challenges and the best practices. Which leads us to the questions, can we somehow support researchers during these decision-making processes? And with that, we have one quick answer and one longer answer. So the quick answer that I would like to leave here is that we should acknowledge the structures beyond the individual researchers more thoroughly. And that is this kind of research being embedded in all these different actors, the social media platforms with their policies and changes, the different legal legislations that may apply, potential research infrastructure institutes that could help with some of the challenges, the different researchers' motivations that we have seen, but also the different user perspectives, different user levels of vulnerability, user expectations, and also changing user behavior. And the other second point is that we want to untangle these design choices and to support documenting approaches throughout the entire research procedure when researchers do work with social media data. And this leads me to handing over to Indira for the second part. We do a slight change in presenters. Let me...
Great. So, great. Sorry, we're in the same room actually, so that's why we had some sound issues when doing the switch, but I would say that went quite smoothly, more or less. So yes, thanks, Katrin, for that overview of the issues that can occur when working with social media data, and which leads to this one problem that we have, that how can we incentivize better documentation procedures, as well as reduce frictions and barriers when it comes to documentation. And to do this, we actually take inspiration from the traditional social sciences. Just like a quick recap or rather a quick detour, is that social media data is quite recent and is one of the more recent sources of data for social scientists. Before that, social scientists used other types of data like experiments or surveys or their combination. And surveys are in fact like one of the workhorses of quantitative social science. And because this is an area that has developed over quite some time, taking lessons from statistical methods, they've developed quite some robust techniques, tools, and approaches for dealing with some of the errors that can occur in surveys. And one of these approaches are error frameworks, which provide a shared understanding and, more importantly, a shared vocabulary for describing potential challenges and pitfalls. They also act as a guide for writing our papers or our communication with different stakeholders, as well as for evaluating the type of papers that we read when we work with survey data. And they can also help us encourage and inspire ongoing discussions about the quality of survey data or social science data. And this type of approach would be especially helpful for interdisciplinary areas, young areas of fast evolving areas such as computational social science, which is using social media data more and more to answer social science research questions. And the inspiration that is mainly present for these types of error frameworks is called the Total Survey Error Framework, or the TSE. These are different approaches for conceptualizing potential errors in survey research. And one of the most prominent approaches is by Robert Groves and colleagues, who provide a typical survey life cycle and link errors to each step of the survey life cycle, so that a survey researcher or any researcher who is working with survey data might reflect on that and document that. And this is one of the visual representations of the Total Survey Error Framework. And so at the top, you can see that we start with a construct, which is a latent concept that we want to measure. For example, my interest in voting for a certain politician or presidential approval. And we want to measure that in a certain target population. Oftentimes, it could be a national population, for example. My interest in voting for a German population, which is something that we would like to measure in the German national population, but it could also be more niche, for example, students or a hard to reach population, such as sex workers or migrants. And when we have this construct which we want to measure in a target population, we field a survey and go over all of these different steps and come up with a survey statistic. And what the TSE does is that it links errors associated with each of these steps and divides it into two types of errors. The first are measurement errors, or errors due to what is being measured, so exactly how we are measuring the construct of interest. And the other types of errors are the errors of representation, or errors due to who is being measured, or how we are defining our target population, how we are reaching out to them, who's responding and who's not. And other people have taken inspiration from the Total Survey Error Framework because of its ability to systematically decompose errors in the survey lifecycle, and have adapted that for other types of data. So these are three examples of error frameworks for newer types of data. So Ashley Amaya and colleagues came up with a total error framework for big data, including big survey data as well. And Hisei and Murphy came up with Total Twitter Error Framework, which specifically focuses on social science research with Twitter data. And finally, Bosch and Ravela recently came up with a Total Error Framework for meter data, which is a combination of survey data and online tracking. And we wanted to create an error framework that specifically deals with the issues that are salient for social media data. For example, many of which that Catherine pointed out before. And so to do that, we start with a typical workflow for a study that uses social media data. So we start with construct definition. The target population selection also happens implicitly, and then we go down the steps. And so during construct definition, we concretely define what we want to study. Next, we select whether we want to study it from one particular platform or multiple, depending on whether the platforms are appropriate or not. Next, we formulate how we want to actually collect our data through APIs, through screenshots, various other techniques, and then we actually execute the data collection. Once we have the data, we might want to clean it or augment it with some extra metadata, and finally analyze it to come up with our final estimate of, let's say, presidential approval or voting interest in the German populace. And so to do that, in our framework, we then conceptualize the different errors that can happen in each of these steps. And because it's inspired by the total survey error framework, we also differentiate between measurement errors, which are on that side in yellow, and then the representation errors, which are in blue. And one specific thing that we do in this error framework is that we account for the idiosyncrasies of digital trace data, which also includes web data on top of social media data. These might include the effect of the platform itself, such as the fact that the platform is often a black box, or the effects of platform recommendation. For example, now that many people have migrated to Mastodon from Twitter, they don't see a similar algorithmic timeline that was very common on Twitter, which showed you a certain type or a certain order of posts, and that then affects how people react on those platforms. And all of this might affect how people behave on the platform, and which in turn affects how researchers access this data and what they can measure from it. So in the next few slides, I'm going to go over some of the examples of the different types of errors and try to break them down and see how they can help us document issues that can occur when we use social media data. These issues could be due to some of the inbuilt challenges of social media, such as the black box nature of the algorithm that a researcher has no control over, but also certain issues that a researcher might have control over, and they might think of mitigation strategies, but first they need to reflect on that and document that. So first of all, we'll start with the construct definition stage, and the first error that happens there is one due to measurement or a validity issue. So here, even before we start collecting any data, start doing any type of analysis, we first come up with the concrete research question of what we want to measure in the first place, and whether what we are measuring is actually what we think we're measuring. To give a concrete example, let's say we want to understand if there's a large movement supporting Donald Trump in his third presidential bid. And so the idea would be that if somebody tweets with the hashtag Trump 2024, is that an indication of support, or is this person merely commenting about Donald Trump's presidential bid? So in surveys, we have a much more direct link between a person's response and the survey question, and therefore the construct of interest. But because social media data is unobtrusive, non-reactive, and passive, this link is much more tenuous, and we have to do much more inference to see what the person's posts actually mean. And so these issues of validity are more salient in social media data. The next step of the life cycle is platform selection after we've defined our construct. And let's say I want to perform a multi-platform study with Reddit and Twitter for this example. And we can have measurement issues over here, which are due to the platform's affordances. So besides the recommendation system, one type of affordances are a specific platform's norms. And for the case like Reddit or even Mastodon, different servers on Mastodon and different sub-communities or subreddits on Reddit might have different norms, different terms of services, different ways in which they allow the users to engage on the platform. And that in turn affect how people react and behave on the platform, and how they express themselves. On Twitter, there's this 280 character limit, which researchers have shown before that it affects how people write tweets, that they have a tendency to write shorter and more terse tweets so that they can stay within the limit. And these are the measurement errors which affect how we're measuring our construct, but then we can also have representativity issues. One thing to keep in mind is that even though these social media platforms may seem very ubiquitous, Twitter is still not populated by the exact German population. And these differences are systematic. There are like much more younger people on these platforms. Many researchers say that it's very difficult to reach the elderly people, and of course, maybe for good reason, younger people like teenagers. And so these platforms are not representative of the target population. And even when we look at the specific population of a platform, they might exhibit very different characteristics. So for example, people on Twitter it was shown that people on Twitter generally are not very political, but people who tweet about politics are extremely political, and they're very interested in political topics. And so there are these differences in the backgrounds of the users themselves on the platform, which all lead to issues in how we measure our target population. And then the third step, after we've after we've selected our platform, is data collection. And so let's say that we use an API for our data collection over here. And one typical way of doing this is using keywords or search queries. These would be usually text keywords. If we go back to the example of Trump's presidential bid, it could be the hashtag Trump 2024. It could just be Trump, to be as broad as possible. But even then, we could have issues due to measurement as well, because some posts that end up being chosen by this search term might not actually be relevant to the construct. So for example, the word Trump might be about a Trump card. It could also be about the Trump Tower, Donald Trump's family. And on the other hand, there are people who refer to Donald Trump in other ways. And if we don't have that keyword in our list of search queries, then we're going to miss out on that data. And so these are all issues that affect the measurement, and therefore are measurement errors. And the way we define our search queries can also affect the representation, or how we get to our final population. So for example, if we only, if we have a bilingual population and we only have search queries or keywords in one particular language, then we are excluding people who might be tweeting or posting in a different language, and they're not included in our study sample. And therefore we're misrepresenting the actual target population. And after data collection, we move on to data pre-processing, and you can see that there are 4 arrows that go out of this step. So there are quite a few errors. So due to the sake of time, I'm not going to go into all of them, but I'll just talk about one more error that I think is also very salient for social media data when you contrast it with survey data. Which is that demographic data is often sought out when we do surveys. And demographic data is important for several reasons. You might want to know how women perceive Donald Trump, or how women under the age of 40 perceive Donald Trump. And that's why demographic data is important, and often we ask for it specifically in surveys. But obtaining demographic data in unobtrusive, non-reactive social media data is quite difficult. Either we have to rely on self-reports of social media, where somebody has explicitly mentioned their gender, ethnicity, age on their social media profiles, for example, in their Twitter profile. But of course, that's a small number, and then that reduces our sample. Also biases it. And the other option is that we use some type of automated demographic inference techniques. But these techniques are also often black box techniques where you don't know what exactly is being used to make this decision. And it has been shown that they have a tendency to at least for gender inference, misgender people, especially people of color. So there are not only issues of how reliable these methods are, but there are also issues, also ethical issues in the use of these types of automated demographic inference. So this is something that we call the user augmentation error that also ends up misrepresenting the target population. And the final step in the pipeline is data analysis. And depending on the modeling technique we use or the assumptions we make, for example, whether we use a certain machine learning method, which assumes that our data is distributed a certain way, based on those, we end up with a trace measurement error or a measurement error in how we are finally measuring our construct. So these were some examples of the types of errors that we can find through a systematic reflection using error frameworks like the total survey error framework or our specific error framework designed for social media data or web data. And the idea is that, like, by using these error frameworks, we could become a bit more aware of the potential issues and pitfalls that might happen in our data, try to fix the ones that we can using the techniques or the methods that we have, or document the ones that we cannot control, for example, issues due to the platform's recommendation systems. And sometimes this error framework reflections can even happen before we've started a study, when we're just planning it out during the construct definition phase. And that brings us to a few closing thoughts. First of all, just thinking about the future outlook, about how we can take this forward. The idea would be to try and link the different error frameworks that we mentioned, because now we have a lot of choice in the types of data and data architectures we're having, especially about linking survey data and social media data, which can sometimes be the best of both worlds. And so we should try and think about error framework, the commonality between error frameworks, as well as trying to convert them into specific documentation and data management approaches, and also look at it in a more fine-grained way. Like in our study, we focused on social media data and the entire pipeline, but it can be broken down into specific platforms and specific parts of the process. To give you an example, this is something that my colleagues, Leon Frohling is leading at GASIS, which is the template for something that we call total error sheets for data sets, or TESD. This specifically takes the TED-on approach or the error framework approach and combines it with data documentation procedures to provide a template that researchers can use along with their research studies when they're making their data sets or their papers available, just so that they are more intentional and more explicit about their documentation and the decisions that they took. And to conclude, error frameworks, at least in the future, should be complemented by considerations of research ethics as well. We've mostly focused on this issue of what can go wrong in terms of making an inference. But we should also combine it with some of the issues that come with data access, sharing that Catherine mentioned before as well. And also come up with practical guidance through the form of specification sheets in these documentation practices. And these error frameworks can then provide standards and best practices for certain steps in the research process. And the final few points are that Catherine showed in her work with the interviews with social media data users or researchers that the research community is very much aware of some of these challenges and pitfalls, but there's a lack of initiative to structurally reflect on them. And to deal with this and to reduce the barriers in this reflection process, we came up with this idea of error frameworks, which can guide these types of systematic reflection processes. And the general takeaway here is that our data sources will never be perfect. Surveys are not perfect either. And survey methodologists have spent a great deal of time in trying to figure out what could be going wrong and trying to reduce them. But even there are certain things that cannot be changed. For example, mode effects, the fact that some people just cannot be reached via a telephone. And there are these limitations. And so there are also limitations in social media data. And the idea over here is that we accept them, and instead of trying to mitigate all of them, we try to mitigate the ones that we can and document, and at least document the ones that we cannot. With that, I'd like to thank and acknowledge the various colleagues who've worked on this project, on the different work that we showed today, specifically Fabian Floeck, Bernd Weiss, and Claudia Wagner for collaborating on our TED-on error framework, Leon Frohling, Leonie Steinbrinker, Felix Soldner, Maria Zenz for our work on the TESD documentation, which will hopefully be coming out soon. And Kathrin's co-author, Katharina Kinder-Kurlanda, for her work on studying social media researchers' practices. And that's it. We wish, Katharina and I wish you many virtual greetings from Cologne.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the great presentation. We learned a lot, especially about how to approach and how to think about the ways in which social media data is, things can go wrong with social media data. Now we will do a Q&A session, and I just ask our attendees to ask us to send us any questions that they can have, especially through Q&A option that you can see under the at the below of their screen. And in the meantime, I will ask the questions that they have already sent to you. So Norberto has sent us a question, Katrin and Indira, and I am now reading his question. An issue you are pointing out is about self-selection bias, only including people that is in social media apps. Does any study explore differences between people in and out in social media apps?
Okay, and that's a really interesting question. Thanks, Norberto. I believe that there are some studies that have been done with respect to Twitter specifically that show the difference in the population. So I know that the Pew Research Center does regular surveys to see what is the makeup of the Twitter population and how it compares with the US national population. And maybe that's like a more general issue of self-selection bias for any study with Twitter data. But then there are also specific issues when we think about particular use cases, right? Like if you want to study politics related topics, then the political Twitter users are very different from regular Twitter users. So for those certain topics also, people have done some studies. And finally, one thing I want to point out is also that it has also been shown that like when people respond to surveys for a particular question, for example, about presidential approval, and then you compare that with what they've written on social media, you can see also a bit of difference. So even for the people who are on Twitter, they seem to differ in their online and offline behavior. So I'll just like find those papers and link them in the chat, in the Q&A as well. And Katrin, if you have any other thoughts, feel free to add.
Yeah, maybe the other thought that now there's also some initiatives of trying to link data from surveys and social media platforms. So I think this is like the newest direction in social media research to try to also compare what like having people to give consent for survey responses plus linking their social media profile in a survey, for example, and then you could look into yeah, like the whether what they display as behavior on the social media platform actually matches what they are responding in the survey. So I think this is a new way this issue is also being approached at the moment. It leads to new challenges, of course, because also this linking procedure is not easy, and it might be another level of self-selection into the sample. But I think there's some interesting stuff coming up over the next years, probably in this direction.
Thank you very much. Another question that we have received is availability of the slides for access later. And yes, we are making slides. We will make slides available if Katrin and Indra, of course, wants to share slides with us. Then we will make the slides available on our website, and we will send an email to participants of this session about slides. We will also put video recording of this event to YouTube, and we will share YouTube link as well with participants. Also, if you want to send any more, Indra and Katrin, any other documents or suggestions, we can share them as well. Anya, do you want to say something?
No, just to kind of follow up with some questions as kind of people mulled over your framework, which was really interesting. And I think it's, you know, it's great to kind of push researchers that work with social media researchers to think and reflect much more on what we're doing when we collect data and analyze it in this newer form, right? So I think this is, you know, really an important you know, point you're kind of raising here. But you know, given your experience and kind of working on this framework, what would you say is the you know, the most crucial step where things really can go wrong? Would you be able to say, you know, this is something that everyone, you know, will have to face? Because, you know, when we think about survey research, there's certain you know, kind of parts that, you know, kind of everyone has to deal with, while others are more specific, maybe to specific questions or something. So in your experience, what is it when we work with social media data? What do you think? So
maybe I can start. I think of course, the worst thing that can go wrong is putting the participants into danger, I think. Let's assume, for example, some people jumping onto the Ukraine war research thoughtlessly and putting people who are actually involved in this military crisis directly at risk, and maybe even yeah, really interfering with things and making that so like we have to be aware of, as researchers, that our actions can have real world consequences, even in close to real time. I think another example is research in the area of what Indira also mentioned, demographic influences, where there have been really problematic approaches to trying to infer sexual preferences from profile photos, for example, which of course can also really lead to really immediate and high-risk situations for people in specific situations. So I think this is something we have to really keep in mind. I think on the other level, I think what frequently goes wrong is overselling results. So to claim more than what you actually have based on, like in most cases, you have limitations due to who do you actually reach, what actually is your setting, and then there's a paper saying, I don't know, political opinion on Twitter, whereas in reality is political opinion of English-speaking active Twitter users at time X. And like this, I think is something that people can easily find remedies for in critically thinking, okay, what really is the conclusion I can draw on, what kind of group am I really looking at? Is this restricted to a specific point of time, to a specific country, and these kind of things? And yeah, really reflect that in the paper title and throughout the storyline, because in most cases we're not studying the platform Twitter. We're studying a very specific facet, or the platform YouTube, or the platform Facebook, or whatever. We're studying a very specific facet of that. And since all of this is so ephemeral, the platform changes, the user changes, we cannot really claim a general truth beyond time and space in these cases. Anything else?
Maybe I just want to add, like, in terms of using automated methods, like, because I think we didn't really specify this in the presentation, but like one of the advantages of social media data is also the size of the data, but then that also means that it can be difficult to manually assess it, and therefore people often use automated methods to for computational content analysis, let's say. Many of the methods that are there might not be suited for social media. So for example, for political opinion, the type of methods that are often used are sentiment analysis methods. But many of these sentiment analysis methods were trained on movie reviews or product reviews. And then this translation to a political domain to deal with noisy social media language, that often does not happen. So I think like maybe one general issue I find is when we use these methods that we're often repurposing these methods that were meant for something else so that we can work with social media data, and sometimes that repurposing works well, but it might always not. And so that's something that maybe we should reflect on as well.
Thank you very much. Katrin, I can see that you have shown that you will respond to a question. Let me read the question.
Type in things for this question, but something went wrong. I cannot type in now. I don't know, maybe I have to talk, but there was one question about potential resources for shared data sets. And I think that there are quite a few, let's say, more Wild West situations where people put data sets up on their own websites, and then there are more structured approaches. So some people put their data sets on Zenodo, for example, or on GitHub and share them there. There is the Harvard Dataverse as a source where you can search, and then like traditional archives like GESIS, for example, but also ICPSR in the US are sharing some social media data sets, and we can probably add a slide to our slide deck when we send it to you for uploading, with some links to these sources so that they will be included in the slides. But yeah, the challenge is there that there's no documentation standard, and that you really have to look also what people actually have shared there. I think that was the last question.
There is also a question, thank you very much, by the way, about mandating research access.
Yeah, through the digital surveys.
There's a
lot happening at the moment, I have to say, and both in terms of GDPR and Digital Service Act, and I was quite hopeful 2 weeks ago, maybe, because there were some signals also from platforms that they were interested in finding solutions together with researchers on how to better enable researchers access to platform data. Also, like finding settings that work to respect all these new legal frameworks. And I'm a bit more pessimistic now that all these big layoffs have taken place at Twitter and Facebook recently, and it might not be their top priority at the moment. But in general, I see a tendency that also platforms are a bit more moving towards collaborating with researchers and finding good practical solutions for making data accessible directly off the platform. And I think these legal changes, GDPR and Digital Service Act, have helped in that sense. I think it's still quite difficult to set up the exact settings for how to make that also technically feasible, how to, for example, control for who counts as a researcher and should have certain access rights, how to prevent data breaches and attacks, and ensure secure environments for these kind of things. But there's some things happening behind the scenes, and hopefully some solutions coming up sometime in the nearer future.
Thank you very much. There is one last question, a more general one. In the beginning of your presentation, you had mentioned that people can get data from social media website through different means like API or scraping. So there's a question especially about Facebook groups, and our attendees asking whether there's a way to collect data, all data from Facebook groups that are public. Can you recommend data collection resources for Facebook groups?
I can start. I believe CrowdTangle was one resource for collecting data from public Facebook groups, but with some restrictions in the sense that it would give you aggregate data about the posts and not really specifically the comments on those posts. I believe since then there were some changes in CrowdTangle access, and perhaps it's no longer there, but as far as I know, Facebook is now working on specific platforms for sharing data with researchers that is soon to be made public. But I believe CrowdTangle used to be a resource, but now perhaps it's no longer there when it comes to specifically collecting data from groups.
Maybe the other pointer here would be to look into the old webinars of your series, because I think there were quite a few on Facebook data and how to work with that more specifically. So maybe that would be a resource for participants.
Yeah, thank you very much. We will actually host someone from Meta next week as well. Anya can tell more about that.
Yeah,
but it's interesting what you're saying, because we talked to several researchers about, kind of, can you, prepare a session on CrowdTangle, for example, and the response was always like, oh, it's so unsure, it's like we would really like to have a session just about kind of this question, right? Like, because I think there's a lot of people who would like to get started in using APIs, but it's just not so as straightforward as it maybe should be. So maybe at some point you want to put on a session. I think there would be quite a lot of interest in this. Yeah, so we didn't have a direct session on, like APIs yet. And I think we really should. Yeah. Okay. I think maybe we will, kind of conclude here. So Katrin and India, you just have to come back. But thank you very much for this very, insightful talk and sharing your ideas about a more transparent research process in how to work with social media data. As we already said, everything will be available, but do please, include some links, kind of what you think would be helpful. And then we will upload this. We have another session, so I could already hinted at this next week. And we will have Michael Sorop from Meta, and he will directly talk about the question on Meta's advertising policies and how to navigate them. We are doing this ourselves, and I think a lot of people also in this group that kind of joined our webinar series use these platforms as a recruitment tool, and it's good to have somebody from Meta to really navigate us, because I think we've all been there, that we're struggling to use the ads for our recruitment. So there was also a question somebody raised this in kind of how to integrate Qualtrics and Facebook and so on. So we will go into detail about this next week and really question Michael in how to make it more efficient for us as researchers. So with this, hopefully see you next week. And big thank you again for Katrin and India for a great talk. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having us.
Thank you for joining. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Stop the recording.